One, and we are recording episode 399 with Mr. David Stumpf, author of Titan II, A History of a Cold War Missile Program. And although much of it was over my head, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a lot of books I start of topics I like, and I don't know how they're going to go. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was terrifying. It was, but before I go off onto a rant, how about you introduce yourself, sir?
I'm a retired research biochemist at the University of Arizona, and had a hobby of developed a hobby of writing histories on military nuclear weapon systems. Just because I didn't like the way most of them were being written at the time, I figured I could at least try and do it the best. My first book was about Regulus, the Navy's first atomic weapon, nuclear weapon tipped cruise missile.
Oh, yeah?
And it was dismissed by the authorities at the time and the historians in the 60s and 70s as being a dumb weapon because Polaris was coming. But obviously, if Polaris hadn't worked, they'd have to have something in backup. So that was my first book, and that got me intrigued on writing more histories. And my wife said, you can't write another one unless you get an advance. And I never got an advance, but I did get a grant to write the Titan II book. And then after that, I just wanted to write one more book, and that was on reentry vehicle development. But the Air Force encouraged me not to write that book. But instead, if I wrote the Titan II book, the historian I talked to said, let's have you write the book on Minuteman. And I said, is there any money in it for me? And he goes, no. And I said, well, I'll do it anyway. So 5 years later and a lot of money later on my own, I wrote a book that I just learned today has sold over 1,000 copies in a little over 6 weeks. So I'm not going to make a fortune back on it, but it's heartwarming to see it's being well received.
I'll have to grab that as well, and I think I'm going to have you on here a couple times now so we can cover all your books. I didn't know you had written other ones. I was just searching for a missile book. I had read Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, which was very good about the Damascus incident, but it wasn't entirely just about the missiles. There's a lot of drama involved.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about Eric, he got a hold of, I was in a 3-year retreat, isolated retreat when he wrote his book. Mm-hmm. And he was stumbling around trying to get a hold of copies of the Damascus documents, which I had provided the Titan Missile Museum with. So basically, due to my energy and making sure the history is well recorded, he was able to write it. One thing, and the only trouble I had with Eric's book was he tended to take, how can I put it? Everything in my books is cited. So if you don't believe the particular statement in the book, you can find the actual document it came from. And that's one thing about Schlosser's book. Nothing in my book is from someone who says anonymous.
Yeah.
If you don't have the guts to put your name next to what you're saying, then I'm sorry, I'm not interested, no matter how sexy it may be.
That's awesome. But that's what makes Titan II amazing.
Well, the Titan II book has a lot of personal stories, what I call human interest stories. The Minuteman book, Minuteman was a much different system, and the troops were not that involved with the missile itself, except the maintenance guys. But on a day-to-day basis, the launch control staff never saw the missile, whereas with Titan II, they were living 150 feet away from it. So
I'm in talks. I've been in talks with a guy for about 6 weeks who's currently stationed in Montana in an ICBM silo, active duty. I have to, apparently they're looking at my podcast, and I think they're doing a background check on me. He said something about, he said by May I'll know whether or not he can come on, but they want to make sure I'm not a foreign agent or something.
Well, sure. Well, the important thing is what the guy has to say.
Yeah.
I mean, he has to be careful too, because it's still an active weapon system.
Absolutely.
Well, good luck. I hope you'll come on board.
Me too. Yeah. With Titan II, I thoroughly enjoyed it because it's one of those things where you kind of hear about these programs here and there, like World War II, you always hear about just these absurd numbers, the 50,000 tanks or 80,000, P-50, sure. And the mind doesn't comprehend it, like you understand $1, $100, $1,000, but once you get into a trillion, it's all gobbledygook.
Yeah,
Yeah, what I liked about Titan 2 was you see one of these images, like everyone's seen the old pictures, right? You know, the silo opens and the fire, and up there goes the missile. It's nuclear war. You see it in Terminator. You see it in all the. Okay, yeah, sure. But when you look at it, and at least this is how my mind works, it's like, well, how big is that missile? And you see it coming out, and it's like, well, there's a whole thing underground. And you start looking up, and you're like, there are men who operate that. There are men on shifts. Well, this thing has, and then what? There's more than one. There's two. There's five. There's 10.
yeah,
I really wanted to just learn a. I just wanted to learn more about it, and I was so happy to find your book because you truly, I mean, from beginning to end, my parents probably think I'm crazy. I finished the book up and it was probably like 2 in the morning. I was on Audible and I just started clapping at the end. It was 2 in the morning. And I was just like, well done, well done.
well,
But
I'm
it's,
glad to hear that.
yeah, because there's sort of a sentimental end to it. You know, it's these men and women that are, shutting down this thing they worked on. They're pushing the soil in and it's, moving the silo top over. But all throughout it, there's just this imagery of like, the first way it will kill you is if it launches and its reentry vehicle hits your city.
Right,
But then there's a million where it's kind of like what who was it? It said about the demon core. It's tickling the tail of the dragon.
right, right.
Yeah, it's this huge missile. I mean, I was familiar with the Damascus incident, but just for example, the other one for everyone listening is talking about, I believe, cleaning the outside of it with rags soaked in Freon 113.
Yeah, right, right.
They threw them over, just kind of clean them all up at the end. Like if you're cleaning your bathroom, I don't know, throw the Clorox swab. And a guy went down there and died just because the ventilation system wasn't strong enough to remove the freon.
But the key to that is for me, and I talked to the chief of maintenance, civilian chief of maintenance at Little Rock because of the accident. And he said, David, the system was never designed to remove
Yeah,
air, those kind of contaminants. Those contaminants should never have been there. So most all of the accidents in Titan
we're human.
were human error. And these people would argue, well, you should be able to design about that. Well, you can only go so far. It's like if someone tries to put diesel fuel in their gas powered car, whose fault is it?
Yeah.
Not the guys who made the diesel nozzle. It's the guy who mixed up the nozzle. So the fire that they had in Sarcy in 1965, again, they had far too many people. Each of the work orders was valid, but someone didn't keep track of the number of people. So the fact they had that flash fire wasn't the missile design fault, wasn't the design the fault of the guys doing the welding. It was the fault of having that many people
Hmm.
in one place at one time with limited ability to get out.
Hmm.
Now it's very sad. I'm not trying to justify it, but
Absolutely.
it's one of the things that bothered me, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was because of all these comments about the missile being a dangerous missile. Um, the accident rate, the hazard rate for Titan II was no different than a similar industrial complex. Now,
Hmm.
does that make it okay to have accidents? No, but it doesn't mean the people that designed it were idiots.
No, no, not at all. It's
And it was a safe enough missile to launch Gemini astronauts off.
yes, yes,
So
yeah,
Atlas had more problems, and no one complains about Atlas, but
yeah.
Atlas had far more problems than Titan II. So
The fact that Titan 2 stayed, was it that it stayed on it was online for 24 years, or was it 24 years past its
no, it was online for 24. It was meant to be, I believe, 10 to 17 years. The Minuteman program, each of the Minuteman sequence, 1A and B, and 2 and 3 were each supposed to be in service for 10 years. And look at Minuteman 3, it's been in service since the 70s. So nearly 50, almost 60 years.
yeah,
Now it's had things replaced and refurbished. The fuel has been washed out and refurbished, but the basic system is still there. And
yeah. And I think that points to, I mean, again, it's kind of how towards the end of the book when it was, a lot of people, a lot of civilians or just, bureaucrats, they point to the Titan II as an aging, leaking dinosaur. And it's the fact that it stayed on for 24 years and there was only what, 50 of them, 75 of
50,
them.
54 in the
50
whole.
shows just how reliable they were and just how important they were. Out of a 3,000 missile arsenal, the fact that you kept these just a handful on, it shows that they held something that nothing else could.
Right, and when people are complaining, it's been my observation in life. When people complain about something leaking and stuff like that, they're trying to justify. They're not. It's not something that's as much a problem as it is. They're looking for something to justify. It's like Consumer Reports saying there's too much, not enough chrome on the bumper of a car. Well, who cares?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, frankly. So
Yeah.
was Titan II dangerous? You bet. Was it a poor design? No. Was it what we needed when we needed it because it carried the single largest nuclear weapon that was deployed on a missile? Yes. Could that weapon make a big hole in the ground? You bet. Was it accurate? Accurate enough for something that big. So
Yeah.
it filled all the needs. And the fact, in my opinion, the fact that they could refurbish 14 of the missiles airframes and use them to launch satellites reliably with no accidents and no loss of no detonation of the aborting of the mission, that speaks pretty highly of the design.
It absolutely does. It's yeah, and there's something about that 9 megaton warhead that to me the Titan II, I wish it was named LeMay, because it just seems like if Curtis LeMay was a missile, he would be the Titan II, right? He wouldn't be
That's
a
an interesting.
Sidewinder. He would be a 9
Yeah,
megaton warhead, right?
yeah. I think you're right. I
Yeah.
think you're right.
Yeah. So kind of on a fun note in your book, you actually answered a question. So I always had this, I'm 30 years old now, but apparently I have the mind of a 10-year-old. I'd always had this wonder, what would happen if like the Pope and the president got in a fight? Would their guards protect each other, and would they start fighting each other? And that was a stupid question that I remember asking like 5th grade. My teacher was like, "Shut up." Well, 20 years later, listening to your book, the vice president, Humphreys, I believe, under LBJ,
Right.
was down
Yeah.
visiting one of the silos, and he brought his Secret Service men. And the Secret Service men said, no one can be within the vicinity of the vice president with a pistol. And the missileers were saying, no one can be down in our missile silo with a pistol. And there was
Yeah.
this sort of standoff, and eventually there was some weird compromise where the missileers could keep it, but the Secret Service guys could keep it, but they had to take the bullets out or
There's
something.
something bizarre like that.
I just thought that was a beautiful microcosm of the pissing contest that is often different divisions of the government.
Yeah, I agree. And the pissing contests that are taking place now in Congress,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like someone's trying to think of a reason to cause problems rather than to cause a solution. I'm Buddhist by philosophy and actually an ordained monk,
Oh, really?
and that's hence the maroon color. Um, and I always try and find, how can I put it? I try and find a solution rather than being part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's what really bothered me about all the discussion about you need to get rid of the Titan IIs. Was it time to get rid of them with 1,000 Minutemen? I don't doubt that. The accuracy of the Minuteman was such that you didn't need the kind of bang that would come with a Titan II. But during the time, in hindsight, that's the other thing about my books. I write human interest book. I try to, and I write from historical. Well, what I try not to do is historical hindsight. I try and write from the there and then. And that's what drives me. There are two things that drive me nuts about military histories. First, a history that's written without any citations. And I've come across several of them. And they're beautifully illustrated picture books, but they're of no value historically because there are no dates on the pictures and there's no source for the pictures. The other thing that bothers me is, let me see, I'm losing my train of thought. Citations. Oh, yeah, the writing from a here and now instead of a there and then. It's really easy to go back and say Titan II should never have been built.
Yeah.
Those propellants were terrible and all that. Yeah, now that you know they were never used, why did we build any of the weapons we've
Yeah.
built?
Yeah.
So,
It's
I've got to think the Soviet Union and China had a respect for Titan II and for Minuteman And even if there are only
Absolutely.
400 Minutemen left, that's still 400 bombs I don't want landed on my country.
It's I've often said it, as horrible as nuclear weapons are, there has never been a more peace-inducing invention in the world.
I would agree. The unfortunate problem is it's if someone makes a mistake,
It's game over.
it's a pretty big bang. But
It is.
well, what's interesting in all the scenarios, when one of the things when I wrote about Minuteman and Titan II was this idea of how close was close enough. And I actually have a lecture I give on that. The think tank people would say, "Oh, the single shot kill probability is this and that," and they never make it over the pole because we never looked at the gravity issues going over the pole. And that's all well and good, but at one point you just have to stop and you have to build the system and do the best you can.
Mhm.
And that's what Titan II and Minuteman represented.
Yeah, it's again, it's you can look back and yeah, why did we do that? And it's you could look at the X-15 pilots that were killed, or you could look back at, early, Cold War submarines that were lost. And it's like, sure, we can go back and look at this. I mean, who knew that the stairwells were going to be severed in the World Trade Center from an airliner? Like
Right,
we can always
right.
look back. You have to go back and look at where they were at the time. World War II had just ended. 80 million people dead. It ended with 2 atomic bombs, fission bombs. We get 2/3 of the paperclip scientists. The Soviet Union gets 1/3. We're at each other's throats. It's a bipolar world, and we're building thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. You got to get a missile system, and you got to get it now. You can't have a 7-hour bomber. You got to have something that can go in 30 minutes because they are. And they did it with Sputnik. So we had to get something out, and we had to get out a lot of them. It's not
Yep.
perfect, but for what it was incredible.
Well, the hindsight is could the Soviets have ever gotten their act together to invade the United States? Doubtful. But
Doubtful.
again, hindsight's a wonderful thing. I hate reading history, any kind of history book that's hindsight.
Yeah.
It's just it's an easy book to write, and the
Mhm.
books without references are very easy to write. Believe me, about 30% of the word count in the Titan in the Minuteman book is the references,
Mhm.
and that's
Right.
because well, here's a story about Titan II that actually brought to forefront the reason I wrote the book. I
Okay.
went out and met a couple people. They were now vice presidents in Martin Marietta or Lockheed Martin, and I went out to the facilities in Denver and Littleton, and was going through. I was hosted by a guy who used to be in charge of the print shop. So when I got there and I found all these documents I wanted to copy, I said, "I'll write you a check." And he said, "We have no way of processing a check. You'll just go ahead and print it for you." So I got thousands of pages printed. But the funny thing was when I went out there, there's a room about, let's say 400 square feet, 20 by 20. And it was full of Titan II documentation from the years ago. And I was able to cherry pick. I behaved myself. I didn't say just copy the whole thing. And I got all this material and I went back about 4 months later and the room was gone. It was converted into offices and all of the documents were then shipped up to the Hill for storage in an unair conditioned blockhouse,
Oh
which
no.
basically meant they were going to
Mold.
dissolve.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was Lockheed had been told, the government said, "We're not paying for storing this anymore. If you want to store it, it's up to you, but we're not paying you to store it anymore." So Lockheed said, "Okay, we'll get rid of it." I'm
That,
not saying they shouldn't have gotten rid of it, but just the serendipity of my
yeah.
being there at the right time in the right place with the right people to get the information I needed was
Well, I
it's
think
continued with the Minuteman book. I've had the same kind of luck.
I
So
I don't believe it's luck. I think you as Buddhism, I think it's what was it? Did you ever read any Alan Watts or Ram Dass or
I've read some of Alan Watts. Yeah,
Alan Watts?
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm basically running both books, especially the Minuteman. I said, okay, if someone has information I have, rather than protecting, there's only one case where I protected some information I had before the book was released, and that took me a long time to get declassified. But everything else, if you called or emailed me and said, I'm interested in this little piece of information about Minuteman, I'd shoot you an email and say, here it is, because that's how I establish the karma in my way of
Mhm.
thinking for having people respond quickly to me.
Mhm.
So for instance, this podcast,
Yeah.
I could have sat for days thinking about it and weeks and yeah, I'll get back to them. But no, I got back to you right away because that's how it works. If I want that kind of response when I have a need, I've got to respond to others,
Well, that,
positive or negative. So
that's why I responded immediately. You got back to me and you're like, we could do this Wednesday. Normally, I like to push it off. Like if I know an author's going to come on, I'll push it off a week or so I can cover up on the touch up on it again. But you were like this Wednesday, and I was like, the gentleman said this Wednesday. I was like, we're doing it Wednesday. Put everything else in it. Went over Titan 2 again, and I got ready. I was like, let's do this thing. I very much I've found it with this podcast. I was talking to someone before this, but I've talked about the sort of profound spiritual insights just from this podcast, learning to treat others well, and the way it comes back in these untold ways that you never imagine happening.
absolutely.
And one of the ways was about 100 episodes ago was I reached out to Mr. Charlie Duke, Apollo
Yeah,
16, the 10th
right,
man to walk
right.
on the moon. And he emailed me back and he was like, normally I don't do like podcast. He's 89. He's like, normally I don't do interviews, but he's like, something told me to say yes, Tommy. And I was like, okay.
Wow,
We
wow.
actually had a beautiful talk. At the end, it got into you know, finding faith or God or, assurance in the after. It transformed into this beautiful conversation. And, we kind of email back and forth, but it's just like, now I've got a pen pal who walked on the moon. And
There you go.
there's some
There you
beautiful
go.
insights. And
Yeah.
but in the same way that the universe has a sense of humor, I love that you're an ordained monk and you also write books about thermonuclear war or mid delivery systems. There's that beautiful juxtaposition, but it's
Well, the reason I wrote these books was not because they blow up people. The
the
reason I wrote it
technology is
was
incredible.
I think people need to know about the technology. I think people need to understand there are a lot of very um, patriotic's a bit abused these days, but very sincere men and women that really feel they have a desire and a need to protect our country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why I write these books. It's the technology fascinates me. I still well, the technology fascinates me in the way that it fascinates me how a mouse works on a computer and
Mhm.
you can click on a folder and it
Sure.
opens. I I gave up a long time ago. I'm old enough to remember when personal computers just came out, and I thought I'd get into programming, and I took about 2 minutes to realize that's out. I do a lot of complex things as a scientist, but programming's not one of them.
Hey, I got into medical school in 2013. I'm smart enough to get into medical school. I played with programming for about 30 seconds and I realized it was over my head. And I was
Yeah.
like, no, sir, this is not for me. But you said that towards the end of your book was, you're right. Perhaps not patriotic because that term's thrown around a lot, but it was men and women who sincerely they took these shifts in literal bunkers in the middle of nowhere, day in and day out, years on end, and they didn't break the chain, and they were keeping peace, and they
Well,
were.
that's what I think. They were preventing. They were. It's not. You could say it's keeping peace. I think preventing war. I mean, it's
Sure,
semantics,
sure.
but the fact that they knew that if anything, now the key question, Tommy, is whether we would have ever launched.
That's
And you just don't know. It depends on the president. They all thought Reagan was trigger happy. This is something that is bandied about in the press and no one really addresses. But when the president decides to launch, he doesn't turn a key. He
no.
doesn't initiate a launch. He initiates an order.
Hmm.
The guys that actually send the order out are in the Pentagon. And from what I understand with the recent past president issues, they said with any president, we have a certain amount of evaluation. If out of the blue he says, let's nuke England, obviously we're not going to nuke England.
Hmm.
Um, if we're
Yeah.
going to, if he wants to nuke any particular country, we have to be in a war footing. It can't be a surprise attack because that's not who we are.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
which is good.
in Garrett Graff's Raven Rock, as well as I read a book just the other week called The Button. I think it's a fairly recent book by a former Secretary of Defense, but they go into that topic, and I know Garrett Graff covers it about how Nixon was drinking heavily in his final days and was very depressed and was acting a little angry, and when he got on Air Force One to be flown home, Kissinger actually told the guy or gave an order down the chain to the man who had the nuclear football and said, "Don't go on the plane with him." And so Nixon didn't know, but he didn't have the nuclear football in his final hours. And in the final days, so preceding that moment, the then Secretary of Defense had ordered, I think whoever was in maybe Strategic Air Command, maybe he was in NORAD, whoever said, if you get an order from Nixon to do an all-out launch, a massive, just global strike, said run it by me first or run it by Kissinger first, because they weren't
Yeah,
entirely sure that he was about his wits. And
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. It's frightening that that'd be, and it seems to be in the hands of one person, man or woman, but it's really a chain of command,
yeah,
and hopefully it would work. I do know guys that were in the hole when the Arab-Israeli War, the first one, the '67 war happened,
hmm
and things got a little dicey when the Soviets looked like they were going to put troops in the area. And he said, much to his pleasant surprise, well, not so much pleasant surprise, but the, the crew worked just as it was supposed to. It wasn't a matter of, gee, should we really do this? Should we really open the safe? Should we do this and that? And they did it because that's what they were trained to do.
hmm yeah,
So if are you gonna would people have turned the keys? That's the beauty in Minuteman and Titan 2 and in Titan 1. Um,
the double.
Key turn was far enough away that you couldn't one person couldn't turn both keys. If you ever want to see an interesting film, um, Twilight's Last Gleaming,
Okay.
it's Burt Lancaster takes over a Titan 1 missile complex, and they rig a key turn that so they can launch the missiles if they want. And that's fictitious because that could not have been done.
Yeah.
But in Titan 2, they had to be turned within 2 seconds. Let's see, I can't remember the timing. It held for a certain number of seconds. So you couldn't turn one and
And
race over and
run.
turn the other.
Yeah.
You had to hold them together. And
Yeah.
same with Minuteman. So
Yeah.
the accidental launch, not going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the fact that we're here and talking, I think, shows that it's not going to
Well,
happen.
that's an interesting point, Tommy, because I remember a lot of people talking about what would happen if we launched. Wouldn't it be terrible? You think? Of course it would be. My wife and I used to joke that when we moved here, and after seeing the day after, I don't know if you've
Oh
seen that
yeah.
film,
Yes, I
where
have.
those kids at a school look out and the missiles from McConnell are taking off. Um, I figured I worked at the University of Arizona, and if I saw one of the Titan twos taking off, my wife, who also worked there, we were going to run home, race home, get in our swimsuits, get on the roof, and get an atomic tan. Why would I want to survive an atomic, a nuclear war?
That's for a second. I thought you were going to say and go hide in the basement, and I'm glad you said what you said, because I've often thought, if I just for whatever, if I was ever in DC or Manhattan and we got a emergency broadcast message, no, what I would do is I would take off anything that would cover like the initial thermal blast. I'd probably get naked, and I'd walk out, and I would try to go right to where I think the hypocenter is, because that is
Yeah.
not a world I want to live in my worst nightmares.
Well, you think about the pandemic and the hassles it's caused everybody. That's nothing compared to nuclear war.
Nothing.
But
Nothing.
the funny thing about nuclear, well, not the funny thing, but the thing about nuclear war is thinking about. I grew up when they were putting in air raid shelters in
hmm
a small town, Davis, California, which is under the flight path to Travis. And we used to see SAC B-52s coming in all the time, probably armed with live weapons because they're on the Chrome Dome
Yeah.
alert, airborne alert. But I just always, my dad said, I don't know if you ever heard of Gainsburgers. They're kind of look kind of like hamburger. They were a dog food, and he actually had us each eat a bite of Gainsburger because he said if push came to shove, that's what we'd be eating. And I
Oh.
thought to myself, we don't have an air raid shelter. we're not going to be eating squat. We're going to be
Yeah,
vaporized.
we're gonna
So
be in the upper. We're gonna be in the stratosphere in about 45 seconds. It's a
yeah,
cloud of
so
ionized gas. Yeah, you don't know. You don't want to live in that world. No one's coming to save you. It's the idea that anyone's come. No, the people that are going to survive are in bunkers 3,000 feet under a mountain. You're not living.
yeah,
It's, and I think that is I think that's one of the best. Anyway, going way off on a tangent. I forgot what I was going to say. It slipped my mind.
living
Ho-
underground.
living underground, nuclear weapons. Obviously, we're talking about the Titan. Um, but I thought it was interesting how they would know immediately when they were doing a test of the system. Or sorry, no, that's not what I was going to say. I thought it was insane the amount of research you did on the acoustic, I guess the acoustic effects of the takeoff. You know, the
Oh,
dampeners, the what?
no, no, you're right.
Oh,
This is back. This is pre or early internet,
okay.
and I get a hold of a guy in England who's still alive, and I contacted him recently just for grins, and because there's a section in the book about a little brief section in the book about building the launch facilities. And I get a hold of this guy and he goes, yeah, I'm Barry. What can I do for you? And I said, well, I'd be curious if you had any information about the acoustic attenuation. He goes, well, yeah, let me send you some slides. So he sent me photographs and actual slides from his collection of the experiments they did, which actually showed you didn't need the attenuating material after all, but
Yeah,
the Air Force put it in anyway.
yeah. And it's
One of the reasons the book was successful was I was a historian at the Titan Missile Museum before I started writing the book. So I knew all about the missile. In fact, that was kind of how I auditioned with the engineers. I'd come to meet them and we'd start talking, and they'd
start
throw
spitting
out something that
facts.
wasn't quite true. And I'd look at them and say, you know, with all due respect, from what I've read with the tech manuals, this is what happened. And they look at me and go, this guy knows what he's talking about. So
Hell yeah, yeah. It's yeah, like just a random thing that I don't know. You know, you think of the entire system, you know, massive liquid fueled rocket throwing a 9 megaton warhead into orbit. You'd think that's what would stick into my mind. The one thing that stuck into my mind more than anything is talking about like one of the forms of sound attenuation was they put insulation in like chicken wire cubes.
well, it's not in screen tube cubes. They
Yeah.
weren't chicken wire, but yeah,
Okay.
they had a fine mesh screen that would attenuate the sound, and inside that, once the sound waves got into the cube, they dissipate into fiberglass material.
I don't know why that stuck in my of everything else. That's what stuck in my mind about this book is I just remembered that, and I remember as soon as I heard it, I was like, I'm never gonna forget that.
Well,
Another thing,
the funny thing is those cubes often detach from the wall at launch. And if you
yeah,
look at the launch sequence out of Vandenberg, you can see these cubes of dark material flying out in the stream of the
oh,
exhaust. And sometimes they get jammed up in the deflectors. Of course, those were the refurbishable silos at Vandenberg. These were one launch items, so they didn't have to worry about refurbishing them. There was one kind of cool story about that, though. I saw had a picture from Vandenberg of a cocooned um, thrust mount spring, and it had the fiberglass coating on it. And if you'd never been to the museum, you'd never know what it looked like. So I got one of my first digital cameras, which had a 790 megapixel um, memory camera, CCD size, which is trivial now,
peanuts.
but it's
Yeah,
pretty cool. And I took it and I just stood in the silo and used the camera clicking away until I got exactly the same view as the picture taken at Vandenberg, which I could never have done with film,
yeah,
normal film camera. But I really enjoyed doing that because that's a detail I go to.
yeah, yeah. No, it's no. Your book is it's wildly detailed. I mean, to the point where I didn't know what was going on. Sometimes I'd be listening to it. They'd be structural piece W1A with a cap, and I'd just be nodding my head like, of course, yes, yes. No one's around to quiz me, so nobody knows that I don't understand what's going on. Um,
Yeah.
I loved, I loved because Schlosser only went into it at the very beginning of his book, kind of going down into the silo. I loved your detail on all of the safety measures about, like the analog lock, the digital lock, but then there are even little things like putting what was it, like like epoxy filled with like copper wire coating on the safe that made it so if you drilled in and destroy the
No,
drill.
no, no, that was, I think you're mixing up.
I think I
The,
am.
the safe was a safe. It was just a heavy, secure file cabinet built at the security level that NSA needed. The I think maybe what you're talking is about is the cover to the butterfly lock
I think
on the
so.
missile, and that was to prevent it. If anybody started drilling through it, it would detonate it would detonate it and cause it to not work anymore. It
Okay.
would detonate it and make it fail in the locked position instead of the open position.
Okay.
But yeah, it's it's just fascinating. Sometimes that backfired, sometimes it didn't. One of the problems they had was with unintended ground shorts to ground that
Mm-hmm.
caused some of the accidents. You can only design so many things, and you can only design things around so many
So
human
many
errors, and then
redundancies.
you just
You
got to
know,
live with the consequences.
yeah, it's at a certain point you kind of just you get there has to be a certain amount of suspension of detail. You can only cover for so many things before it's like, hey man, I don't know, it's doing good enough. Like
Right,
it's
right. No, that's a good point.
yeah,
It's like with computers. You can only
yeah,
anticipate so many times, so many things a person can screw up with Google.
yeah,
And then you just have to realize if he holds all the keys down and hits his computer keyboard with a hammer, something bad's gonna happen.
yeah. It's like you can only idiot proof something so much, right?
Yeah, right,
It's
right.
I mean, but the other thing, there's 2 points I wanna touch on. One, not really a point, just the detail again that you put into your book was the extra strength they put into the hydraulics, taking into account if there was a snowstorm or an ice
Oh
storm
yeah.
or
Yeah, no,
dirt deposition.
that's an interesting story. We had a lot of the original construction documents from Ralph Parsons in the in our archive. And so I was going through looking at that, and I found the original tours. There were two things in the original tours that made no sense to me. One was that the blast doors were filled with concrete. In Minuteman, they were, but in Titan II, they weren't. And it made no sense to me that that'd be true. So I took the blueprints. We had a complete set of blueprints of as-built drawings for our missile silo facility. And I took them to a steel jobber in Tucson. And I said, I've done my calculations for how much the steel in this should weigh. And could you just check them? And the guy said, sure, and did a few things on his computer and said, approximately 3 tons. And I said, okay, that's what I came up with. There was no need for concrete. And in Minuteman, there was. But the other thing that was interesting was I looked at the silo closure door mechanics, and the blueprint had been copied enough times that it looked like it said 6 feet of soil. The door could open with 6 feet of soil. Well, that made no sense to me. I don't
Yeah.
know if you know the angle of repose for dirt. You can only pile dirt so tall before it becomes a pyramid.
Hmm.
And that's the angle of repose for that particular soil. So it turns out only 6 inches was what could be on top of the door, and it was still closed. So 6 inches got changed into 6 feet by one of
Oh,
the dashes being removed. And people were talking about 6 feet of soil on top of the door. And it's like, no way in God's green earth is that true.
yeah.
But yeah, they had to make sure they could open the doors. And after a heavy snowstorm, um, the snow wasn't so much an issue in Davis Mountain, but Arkansas, believe it or not, they had ice storms and snow issues that they had to contend with.
Yeah, I lived in Arkansas for 4 years. Granted, I was 5 years old, I don't really remember it. But, yeah, but just a testimony to your book, though. I mean, going in and be like, unless, of course, there was a snowstorm, in which case it was rated to, in the edges, you had different I was just fast I was tickled by it, that it was just so well there was nothing I wasn't left wanting for any more.
Well,
Like,
that's good. Well, that's why the Minuteman book is 592 pages.
well, I'll have to get that one too and go into it.
Yeah, then it's available on ebook, Kindle Kindle Fire. I think it's $30 instead of 40. But
Is it on Audible?
yeah, they did. In fact, that's a funny story. They said for the Audible book, they called me Donald K. Stump.
I saw that. And I was like, because when I first saw it, I was like, I had a brain fart, and I thought it said Donald Trump, and I was like, Donald Trump didn't write a book on
No,
ICBMs.
yeah.
And I was like,
Well,
Donald,
let's put it this way. If he did, I didn't want to read it.
it wouldn't be good. Well, that also threw me for a loop, because when you emailed me back, it said David, and I was really confused for a second. So my first thought was like, when you were like, send me some questions, I was like, I hope I have the right author, because there's really I was like, if this guy didn't write a book on missiles, this podcast is not going to go well. I wasn't sure if I got the wrong email. Maybe you wrote a book on like vineyards, and I come in and I'm like, so hypergolic fluids. And you're like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. But another interesting thing was, and I wanted to save this, so if you could please explain it, because I re-listened to it several times and I didn't understand it. It was one of the safety precautions, and it was, if something was tampered with, something would automatic. It would weld to a piece of the missile, and I couldn't.
Well, that's kind of it's hard to describe because there's a lot. It's not really clear.
Okay.
Basically, the butterfly valve lock would be shut in a way that they'd have to take the lock off of the missile to repair it.
Okay.
So it would drive a pin into the shaft, and that would stop the shaft from moving. So the propellants had valves, 2 valves, one for each propellant,
Mm-hmm.
and they were called butterfly valves because they rotated. They're a flap that rotated.
Okay.
And if the right code wasn't put into butterfly valve lock and someone tried to launch, it would drive a pin in and stop the valve, the butterfly valve plate from rotating. So they then would have to take the missile apart. So
okay.
it's really bad for your career if you futzed around with the combination.
Yeah. Okay, but that's a brilliant security measure, right? It's not just like your iPhone's been locked for 10 minutes. It physically inhibits the missile from operating.
Well, back in the day, they couldn't.
Well,
do
that's
anything.
true. You're right. They didn't have digital.
Yeah. So it's well, they had digital, but it wasn't something you could hold in your hand.
No, it was vacuum tubes, and yeah, right. It's not that far removed from John
The
von
Regulus
Neumann.
book, I interviewed an admiral for the Regulus book, and I had one of those calculator watches back in the day. I don't even know if they still make them. It was a Zernus engineering watch with the calculus, with the various cosine and sine and all that. And I was wearing it, and he said, boy, what I would have given to have that on board the submarine in 1960, because they had to use a mechanical calculator.
Yeah.
Where you type it, it's a Monroe calculator. You type it in, you pull a handle, and it makes the calculation. It's accurate. It's just incredibly slow.
Yeah. It was I was gonna say, this is episode 399. On episode 11, right when I started, I had on Ken Mason, who's a gentleman who designed rockets forever. He worked under Bob Truax. Who helped right? He was the one pushing, I think, for SLBMs to be on submarines, if I have that correct. Might be wrong.
No, I don't know the particular history, the detail. One of the things about the Minuteman book that I brought to the forefront, which I haven't heard any whining about, which has surprised me, is one of the chapters says, from Polaris came Minuteman, because the Polaris people, the guys who developed the propellants for Polaris, made Minuteman possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually located one of the key people for putting powdered metal into the propellants, which gave it the extra ISP, specific impulse to make solid propellants rational for a long range missile.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I came across a letter that was written to another author, who's a friend of mine, and it said this guy's name, and he lived in Virginia. So I tried with been verified or something like that. I tried finding him, and he wasn't in Virginia anymore. There was one with his initials and right age in North Carolina. So because I'm so shy and retiring, I just picked up the phone and I called and said, if this is the guy's name who did this work, I'd be interested in talking to you. And he said, well, it is the right person. And who are you? So it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I actually also the best story of finding people though was the guy who was designed the Minuteman first two versions of the reentry vehicle for Minuteman. I called Avco, the company that made the reentry vehicles, was absorbed by Textron years ago. So I called Textron and said, I know this is a long shot, but I'm trying to find someone who was involved with Avco. And the guy goes, oh, I know just who it is. I'll get back to you when I finish my sales trip. So he didn't get back to me right away. So I called him again and he goes, yeah, let me get him on the phone for you. And there was the guy, Phil Foti, who was designed the Mark V and Mark 11
Jeez.
reentry vehicles. So I went out and visited him. He said, buy me a couple of bourbons and I'll tell you whatever you want to know.
That's
So I bought
awesome.
him a couple of bourbons and it was just an extraordinary. I went out and interviewed him twice. Unfortunately, he passed away before the book was published. But with everybody I interview, and anybody that's material shows up in the book, anyone, they get the copy of that particular part of the chapter, and they have complete control over what's put in the book. If they say you've got it wrong, I try and get it right. If they say I prefer you not put it in, I don't put it in
That's beautiful.
because otherwise I've broken a vow that I've broken a promise to them,
Yeah.
and two, I'm not going to put something in that's anonymous because that's just
It's
poor
that's
journalism as
it's
far as
just
I'm concerned.
it's poor and it's lazy is when you
Yeah,
know a source familiar with and no it's a source familiar with could be my uncle who I told to say hey say this right
yeah.
it's
Well, that's the one thing about Schlosser's book that, like I said earlier, that
mm-hmm,
bothered me. He had one place someone said something about it. Maybe it was the warhead that was expelled from the Damascus silo.
mm-hmm.
It came within one click of detonating.
That's not
Well,
true.
if that's true, and I don't know it to be true, if that's true, put your money where your mouth is. If it
Yeah.
isn't true, then shut up.
Yeah, I
But
don't think that's
that's just
true.
me.
No, I'm with you because I'm pretty sure that was the case for the hydrogen bomb lost over North Carolina. I don't think that was the case because you said it in your book. Is the guys crawl over what they thought was the warhead, and it turns out it wasn't, and then next to it was the warhead. But it was a
Yeah.
testimony and said just how well the warhead was designed because they were like,
Well,
"Hey, look,
see,
it's
that's interesting, Tommy. I look at it the same way. It didn't go off. It was well designed, and then
yeah,
everybody goes, "Oh, it came within one or two switches of going off," but
didn't
it
go off."
didn't go off.
The difference between going off and going off is a thermonuclear hellscape in the middle of Arkansas or a metal cylinder in the road.
Yeah,
There's no maybe. It
yeah.
didn't go off.
I just finished reading the book. If you haven't read the book, the Goldsboro incident.
That's the North Carolina one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I read that. I actually interviewed one of the guys that was there and doesn't show up. He was top secret at the time. He doesn't show up in any of the photographs, but I have a photograph of him down in the pit with all the clay
Oh,
looking for
yeah.
the warhead. And it was fascinating to see that the team came from wherever they came from and then disappeared wherever they disappeared to. And I actually interviewed one of the guys that was on that team. It was pretty cool.
Jeez.
He
You
was involved with the design of the reentry vehicle wafers below the reentry vehicle for Minuteman Room 1B.
I would I would I wish the Air Force didn't ask you to not put out that because it's the little bit you do go into is so fascinating. I mean, it sounds like it sounds like something I would write in 5th grade if I was trying to be fantastic, but, it's like you had to have tungsten, which has the highest melting point, but, they were afraid of the tungsten vaporizing, and it's just like, "Are you kidding me?" Like,
Yeah,
the fear of
yeah,
tungsten vaporizing.
it's a fascinating thing to look at the technology and how incredibly inventive and
Yeah,
curious these guys were.
yeah,
Just and one of the arguments, one of the critics of my book, reviewing it before the publisher accepted it, which was actually interesting because they were going to publish it no matter what.
mhm,
But one of the guys said, "There's a lot of stuff in this book that could be found elsewhere. You should be taking it out, and you can shorten this book." And my answer to that was, like with Titan 2, I want you to open that book and I want you to have everything you need. If you want a
yes,
detail, fine. But if instead of saying reentry vehicles are covered in chapter 6 of some other book, as a scientist, I that really drove me nuts when
yeah.
you'd look at the back of a scientific paper and it would say,
See,
um,
yeah,
see this other person, they go to their and they see another person. Every time the original source. In fact, one of my scientific papers had a source from the 1800s in it, because that's the guy who invented this thing called Dragendorf reagent. Instead of citing somebody's paper from 1968 or 70, I went back and actually found it. It was cosmic to find. It was in one of the British publications,
That's awesome.
and
But
the
that's
guy's name was Dragendorf.
well, but that's why I love your book, is because there's no, Smith et al. For the 1912 book on. No, yours is, short of giving me the ability to construct my own missile, it is from open to close. You don't like, I knew some things about it because it's just, I have a lot of passing interests. One thing I'd always kind of been interesting was in ICBMs, but the point is if you don't know anything about ICBMs, you can start it and finish it, and you'll know just about everything you probably like legally can know about the Titan.
Thank you. That was the intent of the book.
Well,
One thing I want to do, Tommy, after
Sure.
this, I'll send you an article folder or a series of articles I've written about the test ranges.
Sure.
And the birth of the test ranges, because I also took far too much time and money writing that down. But a lot of this is history that's disappearing.
Yeah.
Because companies aren't saving it anymore, or people are losing interest. One guy told me he thought my next book should be about Peacekeeper. And a very good friend who's in the know about this says the same kind of data you got for Minuteman is no longer in existence for Peacekeeper because they shredded it. It's like they what? They shredded it. He was there when it happened. They just took these volumes and shredded it because the system was no longer deployed. It was like, well, my wife's happy because that means I won't be writing that book.
Your wife had it commissioned. Good. Your wife contacted you. She was like, shred it now. That's the Library of Alexandria did, right? That's like the F1 engines on the Saturn. They not know how to build the F1s anymore?
That's criminal to me.
It's disgusting.
That's just criminal.
It's disgusting.
But it's the if you've never been to the Huntsville Space Museum?
No, sir, I haven't.
They have a Saturn on the side inside. It's an enormous. It's just cosmic to go look at. Just absolutely cosmic.
What? Yeah, it's three. Isn't I think 363 feet? Is that it?
Something that
absurd.
And they never blew one up.
Yeah,
it got hit by lightning.
Yeah. It's kind of like that quote about the Apollo program. If you're sitting on the top of that thing and you're not nervous, then you don't fully grasp the situation.
Well, there's a guy, a comedian. I can't remember his name now. Maybe it's Bill Dana. He did a imitation Hispanic accent, and he talked about being on. Of course, he was nervous. He was on top of 100,000 parts provided by the lowest bidder.
Yeah. I've heard that before.
Think about that.
Yeah, it's what was going through your mind. Well, the fact that this was won by the lowest bidder.
I'd go on top of one of those things in a heartbeat.
Yeah, light that thing. Let's go. I figure you wouldn't know if it went wrong, right? It would just be lights out.
Well, I think the Challenger people had it, unfortunately, in the Columbia, they unfortunately knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's
what can I say? There's not much more you can say about that.
Yeah. So last two things, and then we'll wrap this up, and get 5 minutes left. And I would love to have you back on. I would love to. We'll email.
I'd be happy to do so. We can do the Minuteman, and if you want to talk about Regulus,
I would love to.
Regulus.
I would be tickled. But real quick, the last two things was another one of the security features. I love how they kind of had that simple, it's this. They're going into these complex like counter espionage. They have these like fail-safe systems, metallurgy, and then one of them was, well, what about if you just shot it with a 357? And they're like, that's a good point. What if you shot it with a 357? And the guy that takes that testing box, for everyone listening, there's this guy that takes a little mock-up box, and he's going to one of the manufacturers, but he's taking it on a plane. He gets to the airport, and it says like, whatever, it had like detonation button on the top of this metal box. And the security was like, sir, what is that? And he was like, oh no. So he had to contact the lab or whatever it was. And they had to vouch for him that he wasn't a terrorist. that instead he was just bringing that box. I thought that was hilarious.
That was back in the day before there was such
Yeah,
security
TSA.
issues. But
Yeah.
yeah, you'd be amazed. I think we'd all be amazed. I had a friend that brought home a suitcase full of firecrackers from Florida on an air, and they didn't even look in her luggage.
I
Talk
vaguely
about
remember. Yeah,
stupid, but
I
anyway.
vaguely remember going to the airport in the 90s, and when my dad would be going away on business, and we'd go wait at the gate with him. I vaguely remember, and now the idea of just walking into the gate is just absurd.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And then so the last thing I want to say, and I guess we'll kind of leave on this note, is I know your wife probably wouldn't be happy, but I cannot find a comprehensive book on Reagan's SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. I found a lot of great documentaries, a lot of great kind of papers. No one has done a book like you did with Titan. Man, if there's anyone that could tackle a Star Wars book, it would be you. And it would be amazing. But I don't want to put that burden on you. But man,
Well, now you've done it. I'm going to do a quick search and see what I can come up with.
oh my, I don't even have any money. I will find the money and I will help fund this endeavor because
It cost me round numbers. It cost about 45 grand to write the Minuteman book.
I will start a GoFundMe. I can't guarantee we'll get more than $10, but I will try.
Don't start it, Tommy, until I tell you I'm going to take on the project.
Okay. I'll hold off on it. But
I'll take a look.
It is.
It shouldn't be classified anymore.
Yeah, it's
you wouldn't think.
The stuff that, well, because I've watched documentaries with Caspar Weinberger and Lieutenant General James Abramson, who's in charge of SDI, who's still alive and is on a defense contractor's board of directors. And I've been emailing the company he used to work for. I've been emailing him for the last year, and I can't get a response from him. I would love to talk to him though. But just what they do go into, even in the 80s, that was declassified in the 80s. Whatever's declassified now, I don't even know. But the technology then, I mean, it's the same thing when you're listening to Titan 2 and you're just kind of like, what is going on?
Yeah.
The stuff they're talking about, the directed energy, the particle beams, the mirrors changing in space, and the whole thing is just, I mean, it does sound like Star Wars, but there's not a single good book on it.
There is, if you want to read about the Soviet version, there's a journal called Quest, a journal of the history of space flight.
Okay.
And that has a whole series of articles on the Russian version. And they got really close to putting it up and trying to test it, but then didn't because we stopped ours.
Yeah.
That's, you sometimes wonder how much of it was actually built and utilized because it was disinformation.
Exactly.
I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was a brilliant disinformation campaign.
Absolutely. No, it's a brilliant disinformation camp. We're spending $5 trillion on a system of orbital lasers. Like, man, you know, do you really want to bluff and say it's not there? Do you want to fire your missiles? Yeah. Yeah, and it might have been. I believe the Soviets wanted to put up a carbon dioxide fueled laser. That's the only thing I ever know about theirs, and I don't think it worked, or they didn't put it up. But yeah, there's missile defense stuff, sure, you know, hit a bullet with a bullet, sprint ABM, all that stuff, whatever. The directed energy and the particle beams in space in the 80s, I mean, there's not a good book on it. And then, you know, the reason might be because there's no information because they never did it. It could very well be that.
Could be. I don't know. I'll have to take a quick look. Yes, but sir. I won't tell my wife.
Yes, yeah, please don't. And if you do, don't tell her I told you. I don't need it.
Okay, Tommy. Well, it's a pleasure being on. I appreciate your skills in leading the conversation, and I look forward to doing this again.
Yes, sir. David Stump, author of Titan 2, A History of a Cold War Missile Program. On Audible, I will put it in the description, stick it in the comment. It's fantastic for anyone that has any passing interest. And as someone who failed calculus 3 times, you don't need to understand this stuff. It's a great book through and through. It's fantastic. It's terrifying. And it's beautiful. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You're a cool dude. I would love to have you on. I'll email you after this, and we'll do Regulus and Minuteman, and then I'll nudge you along for Strategic Defense Initiative.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, sir. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Goodbye.